Cue the music. Hello, this is Uncle Skinny Reviews. I'm your host, Uncle Skinny, and welcome to the show I do about movies. And we review them, and we talk about why they're so near and dear to our hearts. Sometimes they're not that great, but sometimes they're a real hoot. And today we've got a special movie for you today, streaming on Netflix. It is The Eyes of My Mother, 2016 black and white horror flick directed by Nicolas Pesce. This movie centers around a young girl named Francesca. We are introduced to her while she's about 10 years old, living on an isolated farmhouse with her mother and father. It's clear that her upbringing is far from ordinary. She seems, and it's very clear that she's brought up in a very isolated environment. There's not really any socializing going on. She doesn't have any friends to speak of either. From a very early age, her mother, who used to be a surgeon in Portugal, as we learn, rears her in the ways of anatomy. Okay, they're dissecting cows together and checking out all the different body parts. And her mother, who is specialized in eye surgery, one scene cuts out the eye of a cow and shows it to her. And she's unfazed by any of this kind of implied violence, even if it is against livestock. And so her eccentricities begin to really flower and grow here. Francesca's life is turned upside down when a stranger comes knocking at the door of her isolated barnyard home. He asks to use the restroom, and it turns out he's a serial killer and brutally kills Francesca's mom. Her dad gets home, and without too much expression or emotion, subdues the killer, chains him into the barn, and matter-of-factly disposes of his brutalized and dead wife. There in the barn, Francesca visits this serial killer and asks him several questions as to, why he did it. He says it feels fantastic. He says, "Are you going to kill me now?" She says, "No, why would I do that? You're my only friend." And we see Francesca nursing this man who just killed her mother by feeding him, giving him water, and even kind of stroking the back of his head, giving sort of some affection to him. As he's screaming in the night her name, her father says, "Well, you got to take care of this." And she goes to the barn and, like a surgeon, like how she was taught by her mother, takes out the man's eyes and severs his vocal cords. He's still kept alive, chained in the barnyard, and she still visits him, feeds him, etc. The story is told vignette style. An unknown passage of time has taken place between when Francesca was a young girl until when we see her now, which is as a young adult. Her father is old and frail, and frankly, we're not sure if the father's even alive, but he's just kind of in the house. Our friend Charlie, who is the serial killer, as we come to know his name, is still in the barn, clinging on to life, and still being fed and watered and taken care of, even though he cannot see or speak. And it would seem that Francesca's curiosity into the morbid and violent has really sort of manifested itself as she goes to bars, tries to pick up strangers, in attempts to not only cure her loneliness and need for company and intimacy, but her curiosity into the human body and violence. Charlie is killed when he tries to escape, and she needs to fill that gap, that lonely gap that she still has in her heart. And so we see her hitchhike down the road. She's picked up by a woman and her infant child and brought back to her barnyard. And at that point, she asks if she can hold the child. Reluctantly, the woman agrees. And of course, Francesca scoops up the kid and runs away with it. When the woman hounds after her, infant child to get him back. Francesca stabs a woman with a knife, wounds her, and she's the next victim kept in the barn, while the young child, whose name is Antonio, is actually brought up by Francesca as her son, and she his mother. This all culminates to a very violent and epic and disturbing conclusion. The Eyes of My Mother is an art house horror film, to be sure. Some of the shots, the cinematography, the framing is masterful and very artistic. There's a lot of expression in them, and they're cerebral. A plus on all those points, because it is a thrill to watch. Also, this movie contains some extremely horrifying and haunting imagery. That being said, most of the brutality and violence, which there is a lot of in the movie, yet it's not really shown. It's rather implied. It happens off screen, and we sort of see hints as to what happened. There's a part where she's kind of wrapping up meat and putting it in her refrigerator. It's sort of implied it's probably the people she's killed, but we don't really know. Also, there's like some kind of conflicting information about what time period this in. There could be an argument made that this is modern day, and Francesca and her family were just brought up in this isolated environment where it's like the 1950s all the time. There's a curiously in the background, there's a television show, and every time we're in the home, it's just playing over and over and over again. It's the same show. So this leads to a lot of like, oh, well, what's going on? What happened? What happened? And there's enough evidence to imply what happened, but it definitely leaves a lot of room for curiosity and, more importantly, imagination, which is probably the scariest part about this movie. Aside from the visuals that we do get to see, which are haunting, but again, not necessarily violent, we're left to think about what actually happened. As far as the themes that this movie is concerned, I would say definitely there's something to be said about the cyclical nature of violence, the objectification of not only human life, but all life, and maybe even a call to arms for veganism in the sense of its comparisons of man like animal and animal like man, and how easy it is for us to slaughter an animal. And yet we see human beings as being somewhat different. And this movie sort of levels the playing field in some regard, if that's not too confusing. Yet this movie has an interesting thematic crux of the fear of loneliness, the need of intimacy, yet that obviously conflicts with Francesca's apathy towards human life, and her not afraid to take a human life and just take what she wants, but then she has to suffer the consequences of what happens when she destroys that human life and she's left alone and to her own devices. Very powerful movie, something to think about. I would say that it's initially a little bit jarring, and for me, I didn't know how to take its level of surrealism into the lack of human emotion involved, particularly in the part of, her father, her mother, and how they just kind of are apathetic to everything going around them, even though we see it as being intensely disturbing. I'd say that's a pretty intentional move by Nicolas Pesce. And so it kind of makes for the art house style of this movie kind of to run even a little bit deeper. All said and done, The Eyes of My Mother, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. I think it was really fantastic. I think Nicolas really shown off a lot of skill and technique with the camera. I thought the script was interesting. The atmosphere, all the tension that's built throughout this movie is really, really engaging. Again, not for the squeamish. Obviously, the nature of this movie is pretty disturbing. And again, some of these sequences are really, truly horrifying. But if you can stomach it, I highly recommend watching The Eyes of My Mother. Definitely kind of will leave you a little bit cold inside. I had an interesting experience with that after I watched the film. But can't knock it. It was pretty glorious. and definitely worth checking out. That's Uncle Skinny with Uncle Skinny Reviews, and we just watched The Eyes of My Mother. Thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned.